Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And tonight we'll be looking at an interesting subject of how policies make a difference at a very early age in a person's life, and how those policies can determine outcomes, whether children do well or not so well later in life. Our guest tonight is Dr. Diane Schanzenbach from Northwestern University. Diane?
Thanks for having me.
Well, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Thanks very much.
So we were talking a little bit before the show about how early childhood activities, well, I'll say interventions, but really, if we think of activities generally, because you don't want to think, oh, I have to intervene in something. You want to set up a structure that does it right the first time. Right. So these early childhood structures, if done properly, have a huge impact on how the child will grow up and how they'll fare as an adult. So tell me a little bit about the research and the kinds of things that you've looked into to examine this question.
Right. So this has been an area of research that's really exploded over the last decade or so. I'm an economist by training. It's a lot of the research I know is by other economists. But what we've looked at is what happens if you take a low-income child and you put them in, say, a high-quality preschool. So this was Jim Heckman from the University of Chicago's famous work, where he was able to follow them over time and find that when they grow up, they're less likely to use welfare, they're less likely to commit crimes. In fact, he calculates that every dollar that was spent on that program returns society $8. Right?
8 to 1, that's a pretty good rate of return.
It's amazing rate of return. But, so that sort of led many more of us to try to understand, well, okay, so that works in that area. You know, what happens if we provide health care to children, or, you know, WIC benefits to mothers when they're pregnant, or food stamp benefits, or the earned income tax credit, or, you know, better schools, and you know, on and on and on. And we're able to bring really very sophisticated research designs to this, so you can really tease out what's the cause and effect of intervening.
So how do you do that? I mean, there's so many variables in a person's life. Wouldn't it be all too easy to miscalculate, to see an effect, but it's really caused by something else?
Sure. So, you know, each one of these studies looks at, has a different approach to doing that. So one of the ones that I've co-authored and I'm very proud of looks at the introduction of the food stamp program.
Are there things you've co-authored that you're not particularly proud of? We'll come back to that later.
Oh, no.
Right. No,
that's off the record.
never, right.
But we looked at the introduction of the food stamp program. So the way that food stamps were originally introduced as part of the war on poverty in the 1960s and 1970s was that they were rolled out on a county-by-county basis over a very long period of time, from 1962 all the way to 1975. And so that sets up a situation where you've got, you know, two children who are born in the same year in adjacent counties, one who didn't have exposure to the program until he turned 9, and the other one who had it since birth. And you could use that to do comparisons of, well, how old were you when food stamps came in, and then what happens to you in later life. We found a number of really striking impacts, all that are very, they make sense from an economics perspective, because we want to think about early life as a time to invest, and that provides later life outcomes. What we find is if you have access to the food stamp program during early life, you grow up to be more likely to have graduated from high school, more likely to be working. In fact, you yourself are less likely to need to be on the safety net. So food stamp benefits in childhood leads to less food stamp receipt in adulthood and less welfare payments in adulthood.
And now the food stamp program, commonly referred to, it's
SNAP now. It was food stamps then.
Yeah, food stamp.
Yeah.
So it's a supplemental nutrition
assistance program.
Assistance program.
Yes.
I got half of it. But that is seen by many today as being welfare by another name, and being something that is given to people who are undeserving for whatever reason. They're lazy, they're this, they're that, they're the other thing. But what I think is lost in a lot of that discussion is the fact that the SNAP, the food stamps, the supplemental assistance, is really aimed at the kids. So it's not so much the adults, and I think that's the mindset of the opposition tends to be, well, the adults should have a job, or they should do this, or they should have made better choices, or whatever. But really the recipients, the beneficiaries, are the children. And they're too young to have made any of those choices, right?
Exactly. So about half of all participants in SNAP are children or caregivers, you know, the mothers.
Right.
And then when you add on the elderly who are also, let's say, no longer required to work,
Or
et cetera,
can't.
you know, exactly, or the disabled, that makes up the lion's share of all people who are on SNAP. So these benefits really do go to very needy people, and it helps, you know, improve their likelihood of eating, you know, healthy meals, reduces food insecurity. But then what we are very proud of documenting was this long-term benefit when SNAP benefits are given to kids. So not only do they do better economically, their health is also improved in the long term. And that's very consistent with other research, you know, from rats and other sort of biological mechanisms, understanding that early life is a very special time, and if you have enough resources, then all sorts of things that flow later work out better because the early investments were made appropriately.
Well, I would think that it stands to reason. If you're malnourished as a child, then your body's not going to develop the way it should have, and that would, you would think, lead to health problems later on down the road. Even if you're malnourished, your brain won't develop properly.
That's right. That's right. So I have two things to say about this. One is, so people don't find it that hard to believe when we're talking about famine and, you know, very severe deprivation. But what was new when we documented it was even these more modest amounts of deprivation, of, you know, just not quite having enough money to make ends meet at the end of the month, et cetera, that also has these long-term impacts.
So that must have been difficult to tease out, as you say, in the data. How do you determine that someone has a little trouble at the end of the month, and how do you distinguish that from someone who's even poorer than that?
Oh, sure. I mean, that's hard, and that's it's certainly ongoing research. But you know, what we see is many families, you know, do well for the first couple of weeks of the month, and just really struggle at that end point. There's some really interesting research by a physician out in San Francisco that finds that at the end of the month, emergency room, you know, visits spike, especially for people who are diabetic because they don't have access to consistent calories, things like that. So, you know, there are many different studies that sort of all lead together to understand sort of the picture of.
Well, it's interesting. I was going to ask how you find the data or where the data comes from, but it seems as though if there are these different studies, there are many people looking at it from many different angles.
That's right.
So the data sets they work with are varied, and they're from all through society.
That's exactly right. That's
looking at very distinct aspects of it.
Yeah. So one of the, most of my research has been with data that the government has collected over a long period of time, because we're very fortunate in this nation that, at least historically, we've made real investments in building a data infrastructure that we can use to learn all sorts of things. And so researchers can use it to understand, you know, the long-term impacts of SNAP, or you know, the impact of school finance reforms, or you know, various things like that. Whereas at the same time, businesses can use, you know, different aspects of these data to understand, you know, what's their customer market looking like, and you know, how should we stock our shelves, et
So
cetera.
it brings up an interesting question about data again, and I'm kind of a data geek myself. So we read a lot about social media and advertising companies, the big tech giants, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, who are gathering up enormous amounts of data on everyone in the country or around the world, but particularly here. Now they're doing it for commercial purposes, but they know so much about you and me, even whether we want them to or not. It seems to me that that data is in fact a huge treasure trove of information that could be used for research like this. But is that available? Do those companies make it available?
So they do sometimes make that available, but the problem with all of those things are that unless you know what the whole population looks like and have some sort of a rigorous scientific understanding of what the whole looks like, you can't necessarily piece that together from just pieces of it. So, for example, some work in food stamps looks at people who use those loyalty cards at the supermarket, and so you know, if a grocery store will give researchers access to that, but you don't know, like, how does the population that goes to this particular store generalize to a larger population? How much of an individual's purchases are done at this store versus another store. I know certainly I shop at, I think, 5 different food stores. And if we looked at only my purchases at one store, we'd get a very incomplete picture. And so that is why I think lots of academics and some of my work in Washington was trying to make sure that people understand the great value of having government statistics that allow us to, have that yardstick by which then proprietary data, other things like that can be measured.
So how does government do it? I mean, we think of these tech giants as being almost omnipotent in their ability to gather data on people. What is it that the government does differently that gets this broader data or gives you the kind of population size look that you're talking about that you wouldn't get from, say, an Amazon, who actually, I mean, if you think about Amazon, they have a pretty good cross-section of America, right?
Right, but they don't have my mother, and they'll never have her. Neither will Facebook, right? So there are, pockets of people who, are opting out of, certainly of social media, and, to my great surprise, even, Amazon, some people don't purchase from. So the census, which is government data, is very careful to document every single location across the nation. So you might remember it from 2010, and we're starting to gear up in 2020. But they send out thousands and thousands of individual, they're called enumerators, carrying clipboards just like that, knocking, first they send out postcards and say, tell us how many people live here and send it back. But then if you don't send it back, they'll send a human being to your door and, and knock on the door and ask these sorts of questions so that we can get the most accurate count possible.
But even there, even in the sense, and there's, that there's argument about census data, and at one point, I think it was during the 2010 census, where there was a great discussion about whether or not the census takers could do estimation.
Right.
And the answer was, well, absolutely not. No, the law clearly says you will count the population. But you miss people, and you miss pockets of people, and there are particular almost subcultures that may not participate, and may choose to participate, and may choose to hide. And so there are going to be particular pockets that you don't get to. People may lie on the census.
Sure.
So how do you know what you can trust?
Sure. So the census has a very large staff of committed civil servants who are nonpartisan and not a lot of fun at parties, if you know what I'm saying, right? Who have thought long and hard about how can we get estimates of who we're missing so that we can at least know what we don't know here. And so that happens, boy, it's a little bit boring. It's definitely dry, even, when I'm teaching statistics at Northwestern, the kids find this dry. But, it involves going back, another time with another group to try to see, do we get a different swath this time? Then we can, compare those two and make some estimates of who we're missing. And of course, something I'm nervous about, and I think we should all be a little bit nervous about, is that we're talking about adding questions to the census, in particular this one about legal status, that many of us fear will make people less likely to want to answer the census. And so that will drive up non-response rates. And knowing what I know about the census, they'll keep coming and they'll still try to get as accurate a count as possible. But what it's going to do is drive up the cost of that in ways that,
and possibly drive down the quality of the data.
Right. But as they, they'll keep working to try to get the quality up, and the cost will just keep going up. So I think that's...
well, we have to see whether or not that actually comes to pass.
We'll see.
It may or may not.
That's right.
And one of the other things you've looked at is school funding, and particularly funding in underprivileged areas.
Yeah.
And so you found something similar there, right? That targeted funding in the right place at the right time has an enormously good outcome, or produces good outcomes.
That's exactly right. So the way that we get at this is lots of different states have had court-ordered school finance reforms. And so as you remember, or many homeowners know that we pay a lot of property taxes, and much of that goes to our local schools.
I spent 8 years on the Proviso Township High School Board of Education.
So you know this
so
in great detail.
I know this in better than most people. Yes.
But some amount also comes from the state. And various states have decided more and more to provide more compensatory funding to areas with low property values. And those tend to be areas with more low-income kids, of course. And so over the last 25 years or so, we've seen a dramatic increase in funding going to the bottom of the income distribution, and an increase at the top, but it's really helped to level the playing field.
And so that's happened in states where these programs have been put in place. It's not nationwide, right?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Everywhere there's been a little bit of a trend, but basically the gap is entirely closed in states that have had school finance reforms, by and large.
Right.
So we can, again, with that sort of approach, looking at, okay, this state makes this change in 1990, and this one does it in 1997, and then we can make some comparisons of comparing fourth graders to eighth graders across this time. But then we can trace out what happens to, well, one, to spending, and then two, to student outcomes. First with spending, because those of us who are a little bit cynical might think that, oh, if the state comes in and gives more money, then the local area will start taxing themselves a little bit less, and then maybe it'll be a wash. We actually don't find evidence of that. We find that when the state gives more money actually goes to the classroom. And so that's sort of first order. It's a good thing, or an important thing.
That is a good thing.
Yeah.
And having been in the school system for myself for many years,
wasn't evident, right? You
well,
could have been.
well, what I found, and this may be just because of the local Chicago area, is that there's a huge component of underperforming schools that is tied to corruption.
Oh, sure.
And that the extra funding doesn't really matter, because if the focus is on contracts and patronage employment, then the funding will make no difference because it's not going to be spent properly anyway. So I have not done scientific studies on this, but having up close and personal experience with it, not just in my own experience, but with others I know who are on school boards around the area, I just wonder how much, or have you seen anything in your data that points to that?
So we are able to see in the data how the schools spend the money. And so by and large, they're doing things like reducing class size, increasing instructional expenditures, so new textbooks, things like that, adding student supports. So those are the types of things that I think are less subject to the sort of graft that you're talking about. Although a fair amount of it goes to capital improvements, which I think
are also important.
as long as it's done well.
Well, it is, and I'll tell you as another example from my own experience, that in one of the high schools, the locker rooms were so old and decrepit that kids coming in, or the visiting basketball team coming in, or whatever, would look at this really rundown facility and think, gee, I'm in a slum school.
Right. That's right.
And the kids going there think, gee, I'm in a slum school. Well, why should I respect this property? It's obvious that no one's maintaining it anyway.
That's right.
And so this kind of capital improvement, just improving the locker rooms, has a remarkable effect on student outcomes. The kids.
And there's evidence of that in the research literature. I have not written that paper, but it's true.
Yeah.
But then, so we see that they seem to be spending this money on things that we think are likely to be productive, and then indeed we can see that test scores follow, and so test scores increase in those places that receive more money.
Now, tying the two together, nutrition and test scores, in my readings about this, it would seem that the schools that focus on nutrition get better test scores as well, because the kids are more able to focus on the work. They're not hungry, they're not distracted. Not only that, what I have read is that the quality of the food matters. If you feed the kids healthy food, they're much better at their studies. High sugar, high carb food, junk food generally makes them edgy and distracted. Nutritious food keeps them focused and calm. Is this also in keeping with some of the stuff?
It's hard to really point to the smoking gun in the research literature that says that, but I got to say, as a mom who feeds children and sees what they're like after they had one type of food versus another, I think it's likely that is true. I would have a hard time pointing to the one or two studies that really nails that.
Yeah, and I can't tell you which study it was that I read, and it was a number of years ago, but it was about a school that had thrown out their cafeteria
Sure.
program
Yeah,
and
yeah.
brought in a very health-oriented, and it was a low-income area where they had troubled kids and a lot of
Sure.
acting out in class,
Yeah.
and they found that the discipline problems dropped dramatically,
Oh, that's fascinating.
just as a result of better nutrition
I
for
can
the
believe
kids.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. They weren't on edge.
Yeah, sure.
Caffeine, sugar, all that stuff
That's
makes
right.
you a little jumpy.
That's right. And that's what we think was the mechanism with the food stamp study. When kids had access to food stamps during early life, we think that they were able to go to school and pay attention in school. Because, as the saying goes, the mind comes in second if the belly is empty, right? So if the belly's not empty, then the mind can really engage in school. And of course, that's what we want them to be doing. We're spending all of these resources trying to educate kids. We want, because we think that that's good for them. We think it's good for society at large.
Well, and if we, coming back to the societal costs
Yeah.
of not doing this,
That's right.
higher prison population,
That's
higher
right.
crime rate, higher medical costs,
That's right.
more emergency room visits. These are all things that we as taxpayers pay a lot of money for, and if we can reduce that, that seems to benefit society as a whole.
That's right. That's why the economists are interested in this in the first place, because we're thinking we're spending way too much money remediating problems, treating them later. If we could prevent some of them up front, everything could be more efficient.
Just like preventive medicine versus after-the-fact medicine,
That's
right?
right.
It's the same concept. It's a
That's
lot cheaper
exactly
up
right.
front.
Yeah.
Right.
That's right.
So I do want to talk a little bit about your experience in Washington as well. You were the executive director of the Hamilton Project
That's
for
right.
2 years, and I understand it's a 2-year
It's a 2-year gig.
assignment.
That's
That's
right.
it. You get 2 years and you're done. And somebody
Yep.
else comes in, and that's can I call it a progressive think tank? Is that a fair way to describe it?
We like to call us, I would call us a centrist, centrist think tank that our motto is to go out to researchers, and because we think that there's good ideas out there in the research literature, out in the academy, but that by and large professors are not very good at getting their ideas into the policy debate. And so we would go to leading experts and say, look, you've been studying this particular issue for a decade, for 20 years. Tell us what should we do? And by and large, faculty would enjoy doing that. And, we'd have to help them out, make sure that the ideas came down from the ivory tower to really be actionable. But it's been very, rewarding to be able to get these good ideas that have been studied into the conversation in Washington.
And actually, one of the things that surprised me when we were talking before the show about the Hamilton Project and the American Enterprise Institute teaming up to look at certain problems. And so American Enterprise is generally considered pretty far on the right end of the political spectrum. And so here were these two entities that might be seen as opponents or clashing, instead linking arms and looking at the thing together. And I think that's a trend we don't see a lot of these days.
That's right. That's right.
So how did you accomplish that? How did you get that to happen?
So we approached the American Enterprise Institute, which we have great respect for one another because, we're very much, based in facts and reason, and we tend to disagree about policy conclusions, but we agree, let's say 80% of the time or so. It's just that last bit where we disagree. And we had seen a real disparagement of a lot of civil servants and this notion that the government is doing a good job collecting data, especially President Trump, when he was candidate Trump, would often say that the unemployment rate is fiction, or that the Obama administration cooked the numbers or things like that.
Can't trust any of the data. Right.
And that's inaccurate. The civil servants who do this work are absolutely nonpartisan and just very dedicated to measuring as best as they can. Like I said before, they're not a lot of fun at parties, right? But
but that's not what they're paid for, right?
No, that's right. That's right. But boy, do they think carefully about how do we incorporate when new businesses come online, or how do we think about what employment looks like when we've got more and more people working for Uber, where there's not standard hours and things like that. So there are lots of people who are thinking about those things, and those of us who use data are very grateful to them. So we reached out to the American Enterprise Institute and said, we think that there's some education that can be done here, and so let's talk about all the good things that come from the data. And, it was interesting, the perspective that I brought as a left of center academic was largely thinking about policy prescriptions, and they kept bringing this is valuable to business, and of course it's valuable to all of these groups,
constituents, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so we put out a report that spelled out how are these data collected and what are they used for, and we're very proud of that.
Well, and I think it's interesting that you note that they were looking at, well, business could really benefit from this.
Yeah.
And I think so often, particularly nowadays, where everything seems to be set up as a win-lose instead of win-win proposition, but to see that's fine. Well, why shouldn't business benefit from that? Gee, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, if they do, so much the better. But that doesn't mean that nonprofits or government policymakers or other constituents for the data can't also benefit. So why not work arm in arm on things where you can find this common ground, right?
That's right, that's right. And we really think of most forms of infrastructure in the same way. So we all use highways, whether whether we're business or
going to school, going to work, doesn't matter.
Exactly. Same with airports, and we were arguing that we should be thinking about statistics as another form of infrastructure.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, because my background is in information technology, and so we often think of information infrastructure, or even network infrastructure. Well, that's just the physical pipes to get the information out there. Yeah. So why shouldn't investment in information be part of the infrastructure that the country supports?
It should be.
It should be.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not sure it is these days. Well,
right.
well, although from talking with you, it seems that there is much more of that going on than I might have thought before talking to you.
But we spend very little. I think the statistic is we spend 0.3% of GDP. So that's much less than 1%.
Yes.
0.3% on all the statistical agencies combined. And arguably, if we invested a little bit more, we could get a lot more out of it.
Well, it comes back to the data-informed decision-making.
That's right.
And if you have better data and more of it, then you're more likely to make better decisions, better policy decisions.
That's right.
Now that's, as we have seen, sometimes policy decisions are made along ideological lines rather than information lines. But it's hard to dispute data because if you make a decision based on ideology, that doesn't change the underlying reality. So the outcomes may not be what you're looking for.
That's right. But if we can agree that we're doing a sensible job measuring this, if we can agree on the facts, then we can still disagree about lots of things. But at least then we've started with a common set of facts.
Was it
Moynihan? Yes.
Moynihan. Yeah, okay.
The quote, that is necessary to say here that everyone's entitled to their own opinions, but they're not entitled to their own facts.
I would have said that was Mark Twain, but it was Moynihan.
It does sound like Mark Twain, but
I
think we credit Moynihan. Yeah.
Okay, well, whoever gets credit for it, it's a wonderful.
I'm sure a viewer will be Googling it.
Yeah,
and correct us both. Exactly.
Yes, who actually did that? It was Woody Allen. Who knows, right?
Yeah.
So what have you taken from the Hamilton Project that you've been able to bring back to Northwestern and inform your research and your ongoing activities?
Sure. So it has convinced me that we need more and better research. And in particular, I think sometimes academics are known for doing very esoteric things that maybe aren't of interest to very many people.
Really?
Yeah, I know. That's
shocking.
Shocking. You're grabbing your pearls. That's right. But there are so many really important issues that are under researched right now that it's made me shift a lot of my own work. So actually, my work since coming back from Washington has really been focused on the labor market and trying to understand why more Americans have dropped out of the labor market, try to understand the characteristics of the low-wage labor market. So low-wage workers are more likely to face unemployment. They have shorter employment spells. They have seen less wage growth. Trying to understand that, and develop policies to change that.
So I hate to cut you off
Oh.
on such an interesting topic, but we're already out of time.
Oh, no.
Yes,
Okay.
believe it or not.
Okay.
So Diane, I want to thank you so much for
Thank
being
you.
here. It's really been a
Excellent.
pleasure. And you're doing so many interesting things. We'll just have to get you back sometime to continue the conversation.
Thanks so much.
My pleasure. And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19, or see us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So till next time, thank you and good night.